You've probably noticed something subtle about certain people in your life. They don't overshare online. They don't panic publicly. They don't chase trends. And when chaos breaks out, politically, economically, or socially, they go quiet instead of loud. They watch. They calculate. They adapt. Here's the thing. They are often from one generation that learned early on that stability is fragile. Today, we are exploring the psychology of Gen X, the generation born roughly between 1965 and 1980, and why their emotional blueprint looks so different from boomers, millennials, or Gen Z. Because let's face it, Gen X rarely explains itself, but psychologically, they are fascinating. Gen X grew up in a strange psychological climate. They were children during rising divorce rates. Many were latchkey kids who came home to empty houses. They microwaved their own meals and figured things out alone. Here is what that does to a developing mind. It builds self-reliance, but it also builds quiet emotional independence. When you grow up knowing that no one is coming to rescue you at 4 p.m., your nervous system adapts. You become internally resourceful. Psychologists call this early adaptive autonomy. It is not necessarily trauma, but it is not pampered security either. It is a kind of emotional survival training. That is why many Gen X adults today appear calm under pressure. They can be cynical, but realistic. They are skeptical of institutions and unimpressed by hype. They are loyal, but slow to trust. Here is the surprising part. They are not cold, they are guarded. Think about what they witnessed. The Cold War tension, corporate layoffs in the 80s and 90s, political scandals, economic recessions, the shift from analog to digital. They learned early that systems can collapse. Instead of emotionally attaching to institutions, Gen X attached to competence. Can you handle yourself? Can you think critically? Can you survive? That became the psychological currency of their generation. Compare this to millennials, who were raised with more encouragement and structure, or Gen Z, raised inside hyperconnectivity. Gen X learned independence not from motivational quotes, but from necessity. Here's where it gets interesting. Gen X does not process emotions publicly the way younger generations often do. They internalize, not because they do not feel deeply, but because vulnerability was not culturally modeled for them. Therapy was not mainstream. Emotional language was not emphasized. Parents often told them to figure it out, so they did. This built resilience, but sometimes at the cost of emotional expression. Here is the paradox. They are often deeply empathetic, but uncomfortable performing empathy. They may show love through actions rather than words. They fix problems instead of discussing feelings. If you've ever felt like a Gen X parent cares but does not say it, this is why. Gen X is often described as the forgotten generation. They are sandwiched between boomers and millennials. They were less talked about and less culturally dramatized. Psychologically, they shaped them. When you grow up without constant spotlight, you develop internal validation instead of external validation. You do not need to be seen by everyone. You need to be respected by a few. That is a powerful difference. While younger generations often seek visibility, Gen X seeks competence. They do not ask if people like them. They ask if they can handle the situation. Many Gen X individuals say they are just private. They say they do not like drama. They say they do not need attention. That may be true, but here's the thing. Sometimes privacy is preference. Sometimes it is protection. Growing up in emotional unpredictability trains you to regulate internally. You learn not to burden others. You learn to carry weight quietly. The downside is that you may struggle to ask for help. You may believe that needing support equals weakness. You may confuse independence with isolation. That is where awareness matters. Resilience without connection eventually becomes exhaustion. If you have worked with Gen X, you may have noticed they do not need constant praise. They do not micromanage when people are competent. They value work-life boundaries. They distrust corporate language that calls the workplace a family. They saw loyalty rewarded with layoffs. They saw corporations promise stability and then restructure. So they adopted pragmatic detachment. They will work hard, but they will not emotionally fuse with the company. That's not apathy. That's adaptive realism. In one workplace study, older employees were less likely to react impulsively to organizational change compared to younger groups. The reason was experience with volatility. When you have lived through economic cycles, you stop catastrophizing every shift. Gen X often thinks they have seen worse and they will adjust. That psychological steadiness is powerful, but it can also make them appear emotionally distant. Many Gen X parents raise Gen Z children, one of the most emotionally expressive generations yet. That's not accidental.
Often Gen X parents consciously gave their children what they did not receive: more emotional language, more supervision, more encouragement. They broke cycles quietly. They didn't post about it. They simply changed it. And let's face it, that is psychological growth in action. Maybe you are Gen X and thinking that you're not cynical, you're not emotionally guarded, you are very expressive. Of course, generational psychology describes patterns, not prisons. Here is the key insight. Your environment shapes your default settings. It does not determine your destiny. Awareness allows editing. Now let's move from observation to transformation. Instead of dramatic emotional sharing, try small disclosures. Instead of saying you are fine, say that the situation actually stressed you more than you expected. Small openings retrain your nervous system to see connection as safe. Strength is not emotional suppression. Ask yourself whether you are choosing privacy or avoiding discomfort. There is a difference. Even if you feel like you do not need help, practice asking for input. Ask someone to handle part of a task. Ask what they think. This challenges hyperindependence. If you are interacting with Gen X, do not interpret low emotional display as lack of care. Look at actions. Gen X often expresses love through reliability, not performance. If they show up consistently, that's emotional language. Here's the deeper truth. Gen X is not emotionally unavailable. They are emotionally efficient. They learn to regulate internally because they had to. They don't collapse under stress easily because instability was familiar. They don't panic online because attention was never their currency. Here is the growth edge. Efficiency without emotional transparency can limit intimacy. Intimacy is what makes resilience sustainable. In a world addicted to visibility, Gen X models something rare: self-contained identity. They don't constantly broadcast. They don't seek validation loops. They endure. They adapt. They move quietly. Maybe that's exactly what modern culture needs more of. But even quiet strength deserves connection. Even independent minds deserve support. Even resilient people deserve softness. So here's your reflection. If you are Gen X, where has your independence empowered you? And where might it be isolating you? If you love someone from Gen X, what unspoken strengths have you overlooked? Awareness is not about labeling. It's about understanding the blueprint behind behavior. When you understand the blueprint, you stop misinterpreting silence as indifference. You stop confusing privacy with coldness. You stop assuming independence means someone does not care. That changes everything. If this resonated, reflect in the comments. What is one psychological trait you have noticed in Gen X, in yourself or others? If you found clarity here, share this with someone who might finally feel understood. This is Psyche Impulse, where we explore the quiet patterns shaping who we become. Until next time, observe gently, reflect honestly, and question the hidden scripts running your life.